Hey guys, today we're going to continue our series in the book of Philippians, chapter 1, coming up next on The Beat. Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Alan Parr. Thank you for tuning in. Today is Friday, and we're going to do something a little bit different on Fridays. We're going to go through a book of the Bible, and last week we looked at the background to the book of Philippians, and this week we're going to look at chapter 1. And what I want to do is I want to break this chapter up into two parts. First of all, we're going to look at Paul's prayer life in verses 1 through 11. And then we're going to look at Paul's perspective on his problems, on his situation. Keep in mind that he's writing this from prison, and we're going to look at his perspective in verses 12 through 26. And I believe that there are some key principles that we can apply to our daily lives from these verses. Notice here in verses 3 and 4, Paul says, every time that I think about you, I remember you at all times in my prayers. Man, what a high bar that Paul raises for us in terms of praying consistently for people that we say we're going to pray for. Second of all, we notice that not only did Paul pray consistently for this church, but he also prayed specifically for them. I want you to notice 5 specific things that Paul prayed for. Number 1, that they would be more loving. Number 2, that they would increase in their knowledge of God. Number 3, that they would be more discerning. Number 4, that they would be pure in terms of how they live their life. And then number 5, that they would increase in their depth of insight, their understanding of God. So my challenge to us today is, first of all, whenever we say we're going to pray for somebody, do we just pray for them once and then never pray for them again? Or do we pray consistently like Paul? Second thing we want to ask is, when we pray for people, are we just praying these basic, easy prayers, or are we specifically praying for people on certain areas that we know they need prayer for? The second thing that we notice about Paul that we need to emulate in our lives is not only did he have a great prayer life, but he also had the right perspective. First of all, he had the right perspective on his problems. I want you to remember throughout this entire study that Paul is writing this letter from prison. He was put in prison unjustly simply for preaching the gospel. And so he says, hey, I have 2 choices. I can either have a pity party, feel sorry for myself, and get angry at God, or I can see this not as an obstacle, but an opportunity. And so Paul chooses to turn his prison cell into a mission field, and he begins to share his faith inside the prison. And as a result, 2 things happen. First of all, people in prison are hearing the gospel that otherwise would not have heard the gospel, including prisoners and the prison guards. And then second of all, he also says that other Christians are gaining more confidence in sharing their faith because they see how Paul is enduring his trial in prison. 2 points of application here. First of all, be careful not to get so self-consumed and caught up in your own personal prison that you miss the opportunities that God has placed around you to share your faith with other people and to encourage people who also need encouragement. Second of all, we see here that people are watching you in terms of how you handle the difficulties and trials in your life. And whenever you handle them in faith, it gives other people the confidence to do the same. Secondly, Paul had the right perspective on ministry. Notice he says here in verse 15 that there are some preachers who are preaching out of envy and rivalry. And I need to explain this for a second. Paul was like the superstar preacher. Everybody was envious of Paul because wherever he went, he was planting churches. People were getting saved. And there were some preachers who saw Paul's imprisonment as an opportunity now to get their names going, to get their platforms off the ground, to get their reputation going. And so Paul says, you know what? I can sit here and try to compete with them, or I can thank God that even though they may be preaching from a wrong motive and a wrong perspective, that either way, the gospel of Jesus Christ is being preached. So one of the things we learn here about Paul is that he didn't have an empire mentality. He had a kingdom mentality. And I think there's too many people in the church that are just consumed with their own little small empire and building that up rather than focusing on what God is doing in the kingdom. Finally, Paul had the right perspective on life. I want you to notice here in verse 21 where he says, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. So in other words, Paul's saying, hey, me being in prison, this is a win-win situation for me because if I live through this thing, it just gives me more of an opportunity to share my faith and preach the gospel, thus more people getting saved. But if I die, I get to be with Jesus Christ, and that is even better. So the principle here is to not get so caught up in our earthly life, our material possessions, our careers, and everything we have going on here on earth that we forget that we are not living for time, but rather for eternity. So guys, I just skimmed the surface here in chapter 1. There's so much that I left out, and I want to hear from you. What has God spoken to you in this first chapter? Leave them in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to invite someone else to join us in this study. I'm so excited about it. Hey, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next Friday on The Beat.